Good evening, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Katie from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Jonathan Wells launching his new book, The Skinny. He will be talking with Adrienne Brodeur, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Jonathan, Adrienne, and the team at DE Books for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. There's just a few housekeeping things to go over tonight before we get started. In our Zoom webinar, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple of different ways that you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and to interact with fellow attendees. But if you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that in the Q&A module, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program, so please make sure you're putting your questions there and not in the chat. And importantly, tonight's featured book, The Skinny, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our stores from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. at our Fulton Street location and our Flatbush location, where you can purchase Jonathan's book and many others on site. You can also order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll be dropping the buy link in the chat in just a moment. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Adrienne Brodeur, author of the best-selling memoir, Wild Game, My Mother, Her Lover, and Me, which was named a Best Book of the Year by Audible, BuzzFeed, Library Journal, NPR, People, Real Simple, Slate, and The Washington Post. Her essays have appeared in the Boston Globe, Glamour, O Magazine, The National, The New York Times, Vogue, and other publications. Adrienne is the executive director of Aspen Words, a literary nonprofit program of the Aspen Institute, and splits her time between Cambridge and Cape Cod, where she lives with her husband and children. She will be speaking with our featured author, Jonathan Wells. Jonathan has published 3 poetry collections with 4-way books, Debris, Train Dance, and The Man with Many Pens. His poems have appeared in The New Yorker, Plowshares, Agni, the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day series, and many other journals. His new book, The Skinny, is his first book of prose. At age 14, Jonathan Wells weighed just 67 pounds, triggering a scrutinizing persecution of his body that will follow him into adulthood. The resulting book, named a Best Book of the Summer by Vogue, is a candid, powerful, and quietly humorous memoir about the universal exploration of adolescence and self-image, the frailty of masculinity, and all the places we seek comfort in the world that tries to define us. Jonathan is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Adrienne and with all of you. Please take it away, Jonathan and Adrienne.
Hi there, Jonathan. It's good to see you.
Nice to see you. Hi. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Adrienne.
It's just been so great to dip back into this incredible book. I love the cover art. Is that you?
That's me on the front steps of my home with my father.
Well, it's beautiful. It's really beautiful. And as you know, I read a lot of memoir, and yours hits this incredible sweet spot of both telling an unusual story in a way that even for those of us who, haven't had a similar story, can relate deeply, because yes, it's about weight and it's about body image, but it's also about acceptance and identity and a child yearning for his parents' love and the universal need to be seen. So it's a gorgeous, gorgeous book, and bravo, congratulations on the publication. And why don't you just take it away with your reading?
Thank you so much. That's very, very, very sweet and means a lot to me. I'm going to read a section toward the end of the first part, when my father started to be concerned about my weight. His initial interest was natural diets and exercise and programs like that. And then it kind of got sort of gradually crazier and crazier. And this scene occurs after it's kind of reached its craziest point. And his annexation of my body and my life has become nearly total. And I realized, as you'll see in this scene, that also effectively what he's done is he's torn me away from my relationship with my mother, which had been previously fairly close. So that's where I'm starting. For weeks, I avoided my mother. When she asked me her usual probing questions, offering me a penny for my thoughts, I gave nondescript answers and ignored her searching stares. I'd never wanted to hide from her as badly as I did then. Clearly, she knew something was wrong. One day after school, I sensed that I couldn't postpone visiting her any longer. I would have to pretend that there were no barriers between us, or she would get suspicious. Despite the forbidden subject, I wanted to feel the same attention and adoration I'd always felt when I was younger, and so I knocked on her bedroom door. I didn't hear a reply, so I walked in. The pale blue bed cover embroidered with my parents' intertwined initials in dark blue florid script was pulled tight over the mattress. "Mom," I called out. "I'm in here," she said. "Come in." I turned the corner and she was sitting at her vanity in a blue satin slip with spaghetti straps facing the floor-to-ceiling mirrors. I took my usual position, lying on my side on the small love seat, looking at her almost naked back. We made eye contact through the mirror. For the first time in all of my visits to my mother's dressing room, her state of undress made me anxious. I wanted to stay with her, but I didn't want to watch as she chose her outfit and made herself up. Suddenly that felt too intimate, almost taboo. Maybe it had been acceptable when I was a boy, but the experience that I'd had put an end to that. Not to mention, I was withholding a lethal secret. I wanted to pretend that the nature of our bond hadn't changed, but the tension in my head told me that was wrong. If I wasn't careful, everything would spill out, and I would be the cause of my parents' rupture, the dissolution of the family, or possibly something worse. She went through the usual rituals of attending to her hair and makeup, choosing her bracelets, rings, and necklaces, and smoothing the hairs down on the hairpieces propped on their white styrofoam heads in front of her. They formed the army she mustered each afternoon to prepare for the evening. "I'm so glad you came to visit," she said. "I feel as if we haven't spoken to each other in months. What have you been thinking about, John?" she asked. My only thoughts were of silence, disappearance, and obfuscation. In the past, this standard opening question had been an invitation to spontaneously say what was on my mind. Sometimes I talked about what happened at school, and sometimes I didn't feel like saying anything. It had always felt to me that she wanted to know too much. Whenever I clammed up, she filled the gap. She told me where she'd driven that day and the dress she'd seen at the shop in Chappaqua that she wanted to buy. I followed her as she flitted from topic to topic absent-mindedly. As she talked, she picked up the tall bottle of Kalesh perfume from the glass tabletop and squirted it in the air around her. "John, did you know that some women think that the best way to wear perfume is to spray it in front of you and walk into it? Otherwise, it's too intense, too concentrated. Some women are wacky. Do you know how women choose men? They pay complete attention and draw pictures for themselves. He must be courtly and polite, handsome, of course, intellectually curious and curious about her, solicitous of her feelings, interested in the world and respectful of all women, able to grasp abstract ideas yet be a pragmatist. He must hold doors open for her and let her pass through them first. He must notice what she wears and how she combines her colors. He must be flattering about her appearance, or how will she know that he even noticed her? When we were in college, the boys from Yale were exceptional. We always knew that they looked at us, but we could never catch them doing it. That is how a man should be, not some leering, ogling Neanderthal." As she said this, she twisted around on the thin green velvet cushion on top of the white cast iron stool and gave me a stern, meaningful look. "I think you know who I'm talking about," she said. Through the enchanting fog of perfume and hairspray, her eyes drilled into me. I knew who she was describing. She had referred to my father before as a caveman who pawed her when she hadn't invited it. Her favorite word for him and the behavior of men like him was uncouth. When you grow up, she said, I want you to be a gentleman, whether you go to Yale or not. She stood up and smoothed down her slip. She slid open one of the giant white doors and touched each blouse until she found the one she wanted. I tried to imagine what combination of mood or whim made her select one over another, but it almost didn't matter what she picked because she looked stunning in all of them. Her eyes shone. She smiled warmly and broadly, like the princess she had once been, the first Jewish princess of the Aksarben Ball, Aksarben being Nebraska, her home state spelled backwards. She kept the picture of herself in her long copper-colored gown on her dressing room table. It established beyond any doubt what a beautiful woman she was, and she reveled in the attention that her appearance brought from the men who swarmed around her. Flirting with them came so naturally to her that she did it without meaning to. When she lifted her chin, gave her luminous, compassionate smile that accompanied the hypnotic music of her jewelry, she convinced herself completely that her coyness was harmless and playful.
Wow, that was beautiful.
Thank you.
Biggest treat about listening to you read is just, you're a poet. That's what all your other books have been, and it's such a delight hearing each of these, just how detailed and specific and precise you are with language and obviously with memory, and we'll talk all about that as we proceed. But I think always the good opening starting point with Memoir is, why now? What made you write this book at this particular moment in your life, not at 30 or 25?
Well, it was really a sequence of coincidences. I just finished my second collection of poems, which I was obsessed by for years, and I wanted to do something funny, something light. And so I thought, a lark, that's what I need, a lark. So I thought, well, I'll write about my weight. Everybody thought that was funny. Everybody, even my father thought it was funny. My friends thought it was funny. My wife thought it was funny. And so I thought, I'll just, write those down and somehow chain them together. And, obviously I wrote the first chapter and I thought, no, this isn't that funny. This has got more to it. And then I started to think about weight in a way I'd never thought about it before. And I wanted to in some way to keep it light, but without losing a sense of meaning and what the significance was.
It's so interesting to me because when I went through my own process before figuring out how to write my own memoir, I remember also thinking, oh, this should be like a rom-com script or something. And I think, honestly, it's a very natural thing, I think, is to hide the pain, the difficulty in humor. And that's certainly something that I did for years. Was it Adrienne Rich who said the unconscious wants the truth? I mean, I'm sure as you sat down, that was just gonna, no dice, Jonathan. We're not gonna let you just make this light and simple, because it is a complicated process, and processing it all, and also just sort of, I mean, I'm curious. I think you sort of said this, but in the writing of it, in trying to find the words that match the experience and the feeling, it sounds like you also realized so much more about the events of your life, like you gained consciousness about it.
Right. Well,
how long did it take you to write?
Well, probably it's 8.5 years since I started it. I really worked on it for 6 years. I wrote 9 complete drafts, and around 3 or 4 years into it, I gave it to a very good writer friend to read, and he said, to me, well, this is great. You're a good writer, blah, 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 well done. He said, but you left out everything important.
Love
And
those
I
people.
said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, you left out how the boy felt. And I was just, that completely rocked me because I thought that was in there. And he said, no, 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 it's not there. And that presented such a dilemma because not only did I not know what I felt, I didn't even know where the feelings went.
Right.
And so that started a completely new process in writing the book because I really had to relive it. To remember what I felt, to recognize what I felt, to, you know.
And what was that process? I mean,
Well, I knew I couldn't do it myself, so I asked an editor friend to help me with saying, you know, this is my problem. So, and she went through the book and she said, you know, there probably, you know, there must have been 100 places where she just put a question mark and said, what did you feel? What did the boy feel? I mean, it was sort of, you know, it was like editorial shrink. And yet it came with force because
right.
I knew she was right. I
Right.
knew I didn't know. And as the events occurred, there wasn't a consciousness of them.
Right. Because of course you were a child for much of it. And did you find you had to sort of pull out the adult feelings and consciousness about it? You know, when you're trying to, because you did such a beautiful job of representing yourself at the ages you were along the way, which I think is a very tricky thing to do, not to sort of superimpose your, you know, shock of the adult. What was he thinking or something? And that's, you know, was that part of that, sort of separating those things out?
Absolutely. From the beginning, I knew that I had to write it through the boys, me as a boy.
Yeah.
I don't want to use this weird, bizarre third person aura of the boy, but me as a boy, what he saw and felt at the time.
Yeah.
And what he observed. And I didn't want to write a reminiscence. I mean,
right.
It's just that I didn't want to go back and analyze myself from this vantage point. And
Wow.
and did you think about that? I mean, you were concerned about that?
I was, and I found in the beginning, I did bring much more of my adult, you know, this like lofty voice would come in, and I was just like, get out of here, you know, this is. I had a harder time doing what I think you did incredibly successfully, which was just bring us into the immediate present of the feelings at the time. I think I got there, but I had to quiet my current self from sort of describing how I, you know, should have felt or something like that. I mean, it was just, you know, it's tricky because I think some people think memoir is, you know, autobiography and you're just writing down the facts, but of course it's all about your consciousness about what happened. It's far more important than the events themselves. And it's just, I'm also curious if you think being a poet kind of gave you some unusual advantages to that mindset of sort of being very present.
I don't think being a poet really affected that. I think being a poet affected me and the writing of it in other ways. You know, a book of poems at best is 5,000 words. This is 80,000 words. And so, you know, the search for the perfect word is very different in a book of prose than it is in a book of poems. And so that was more how the poetry side affected me. I just had to stop obsessing about, you know, the right word in each case. I otherwise it would have been undoable.
Well, I think you also have some deep muscle memory because you do tend to land on the perfect words. So what are you a person who reads while you write, or do you do you, some people say, I will not read memoir while I'm writing a memoir. I will not read fiction when I'm writing a novel.
I read, as I always have done, I read everything. I found, except with one exception, would not read Catcher in the Rye.
Good exception. Tell us about that, and also what books did influence you.
Yeah, I started reading Catcher in the Rye. I hadn't read Salinger since I was a kid. And within 3 paragraphs, I knew I had to put this down because it was so hypnotic, the prose, that I would start mimicking without wanting to or knowing I had immediately.
Huh.
And so I had, and that was, so I had to put that away immediately. And that had been a problem with my first 2 drafts. I'd read a great book on the suggestion of a friend called My Father and Myself, and by an English writer from the 1930s named J.R. Ackerley. And it's a fabulous book about a son discovering that his father had a whole other family, except that it was written in the vernacular of the 1930s. So as were my first 2 drafts. They're all of the sort of unnecessary prepositions and not as if to say, and all of these sort of, circumlocutions which don't or would seem archaic now. But there are many. This Boy's Life by Tobias Wolff is, I think, really just an incredible book that I read several times.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it does take a person a while to find their own voice when writing something as intimate as their own memoir. But I wonder if some of those thus and hither things were actually also just like keeping the wall around you, keeping yourself a little protected, keeping the reader at arm's length as you worked through the material to get, closer to it.
Maybe. I mean, self-protection isn't my forte. With the exception of The Catcher in the Rye, I just read, across genre, and I read a Sarah Manguso and Donald Antrim and their memoirs, and many Emma Brock's, and so as well as fiction, and I always read a lot of poetry. So
right. And so what is your, did you have a daily get up, have my coffee, you start to work? Like what's your actual process? Are you a binge writer or?
No, I'm I'd say a disciplinarian of the minimal. In other words, I set myself a goal of 600 words a day, and I only exceeded it once. And I never, I never came under. I mean, and I went to an office every day like it was my job, and which I did with my.
It was.
And I have this weird self-discipline where I just do it, and some days are good and some days are terrible, but I do it anyway.
Well, and I will say 600 words a day, I envy that. I mean, I write in the very early morning hours before I start my day job, but I'm happy if I can get, a beautiful page or 2 out. So I'm impressed.
Well, it took so many passes. I'm sure, I don't know how many drafts you wrote, but I suspect several.
I don't even think I could tell you, because it wasn't like, okay, here's one and here's the next. It was just this constant revising and I mean, it wasn't as clean as I finished a draft and then I did another. I mean, it just felt like it just kept hatching and going on and on and on.
Yeah, and I don't know about your experience, but scenes came in, scenes went out.
Yeah.
As people said, you got to take that scene out. So dutifully, I took it out, then realized I couldn't take it out. So, all of those.
And this is where craft comes into it so much in structure, because it is there are multiple levels. You pull one thread and the whole thing unravels, and you really have to think about, sort of all the support beams and everything else, just to mix a lot of metaphors in there. How did you tell me a little bit about memory? And we all know it's hugely fallible. We also, as memoirists, know that what we remember and are sure of might not be how anyone else remembers or are sure of things. And so, in my case, I sort of relied a lot on a lot of journals, and I did talk to people, and I was very lucky that mine, similarly to yours, it was really focused on my relationship with one person. So there were other characters, but there were no real issues with the other characters. So the complicating issue was limited mostly to very personal interactions, which was similar with yours. But still, it's a lot to figure out what was said and how it was said and so on.
Yeah. I never kept a journal. I had my passports, and so I knew how much I weighed and how tall I was at specific points. I had, trauma is a fabulous crystallizer of detail. And so in the more bizarre scenes, those were crystal clear. Those were unforgettable to me. And in an almost surrealistic way that, I can remember exactly who said what at different times. I could, that was all vivid to me. Right. And then, with my siblings, I talked to my brother, and he filled in parts for me that I didn't know. And but I think that also that memory is connective, right? And for me, the way my mind works is once I have exactly what the room looks like, then I remember exactly what the conversation is. Or vice versa. If I remember exactly what the conversation is, then I know what the surrounding is.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it also works really differently for all of us, because I never felt like I knew exactly what the conversation was, but I felt like I always knew how I felt about the conversations and the emotions that they elicited in me. And so I could replicate them fairly accurately in that way, but I could never, honestly, after this, I won't remember the exact words we said. But to your point, on those big moments, on those big scenes where you just, that are sort of frozen in our filing cabinet of our mind, they do kind of
right.
Much easier. And it is, I think the sort of, maybe you did this like me, but it seemed like you did have lots of really powerful moments, and you wrote it kind of novelistically. It's scenes, and then, the sort of sinew that connects those scenes. But I really felt very powerfully in those moments with you.
That's what I was really most hoping for.
Yeah.
I really, I tried not to over elaborately describe, but describe enough so that you could feel like you were there. And in a way, that's what makes a scene work.
All the details.
The Chekhov story, the detail puts you in the place, and also it makes you think it's contemporary. It could be. It could be happening, absent a change of costume and custom and so on. It could be happening today.
Well, and just what you read to us. I could see the spaghetti strap. I could see the wigs. I could see, her walking through the perfume. It just was all so palpable and lovely. So you definitely definitely hit it. But it is funny how many people question, and I think we all have to realize, your responsibility as a memoir is to tell the truth as you remember it. And obviously that involves a lot of fact checking and checking yourself. But I remember Darren Strauss being in a panel that I listened to once, and there was this moment in his book that, you know, his mother objected to, and it was him going to a funeral, and he said he was just there alone with his father, and she was like, I was there, and he felt terrible, and he was going to try to rewrite it with his mother, but it wasn't what he remembered. And I always, that really stuck with me, because, you know, that's his truth.
Well, you know, and I found out through the fact checker that the length of Acclaimed in Geneva is not anywhere near what I remembered it to be.
Yeah.
So how do we deal with that? Do we call it its real size, or do we call it the size that I remember? And I think it was important that we called it the size that I remember, which was oceanic.
Yeah.
Rather than, you know, 30 miles from side to side between Switzerland and France. And so, you know, there were many places where I just got stuff wrong and, you know,
Yeah.
technically wrong. So, you know, and, you know, and siblings help with that, help you remember what you got wrong.
Right. And then, you know, so there are the technical things, and then the emotional things you can't get wrong, because they're how you feel. And so if your sibling remembers it otherwise, or someone else does, I really loved the epigraph, the St. Augustine one, which was, what does my weight is my love? What does that mean to you?
Well, I first of all, I'm secular, so I'm understanding that in my own non-religious way. And to me, it means that when you reach your weight, the weight you should be, where you're at rest and at peace in nature, then you are capable of love. And that's what my weight is my love means, which is one of his most well-known principles. And also remember that he was really the first memoirist. I mean, no one had written a book like that before. And so when he described things being out of balance, the weight being wrong, and that meant that love was impossible. Once he reached his weight, and once I attained the weight of my fantasy dream in the book of 100 pounds, which I dreamt of for 20 years, then that signified to me, in looking back at the story, that then I was capable of love, because I was in balance, or in some kind of balance, or balanced for that time. So that's why I felt it was really important. And just another facet of that is that if I was in balance, then I could see, not only apprehend what was love in me, but I could also apprehend what was love coming from other people, that rather than seeing it as aggression or vengeance or animosity. Once I found that balance, and it's always shifting, but once I found it, or you're in that spot, then all of these other things feel like they open. And so that's why it was such an important quote. And I picked it right after I began the book in 2014, or no, 2013. And I really didn't, you know, I didn't pay much attention to it. And as I wrote, I ignored it. And then I got to the end, and it was going to be published, and I looked at it and I thought, that quote in so many ways tells the story of the book, that in capsulized form.
Yeah, and it's also literal for you as well as metaphorical, which is just like amazing.
Right. I mean, and you know, of course, for him, he meant it as his love was his love for for Jesus, for God, and so on. And that's how, after his very disturbed life, he defined his himself at that point. But you know, so it really, and the Montaigne quote, in a way, the same, you know, I mean, I wouldn't dare compare saying that what I was trying to do was what Montaigne did. But the fact that Montaigne said that the only important thing in a man is stature, does cast an interesting light on this story. Because if you don't have stature, what are you? If you're not a man in that sense, then what are you? So.
And were you expecting when you started this book that it would take on these bigger themes, like, you know, really, what is masculinity in this country and how do we feel about it? I mean, you were telling a very personal story, but it's so relevant to.
Honestly, I had no idea.
Yeah.
And and two, I had no idea that it would resonate, you know, with other people. I thought, okay, well, you know, thin people will get it, thin men will get it, but, you know, that's, how do we define that market? And
That's a good point.
Wallace Stevens said, "Oh, thin men of Hatton," you know. So, but that's not a market. That's a line in a poem. And so, but it's what's been interesting is how people bring to it their own inadequacy, their own sense of inadequacy,
Right.
and identify. I mean, and I've had a lot of people who I know slightly or don't know at all say, you know, thank you for writing this down for me. I said, well, I didn't write it for you, but okay, I accept.
No, but that's the highest compliment. And you know, when people say, which, you know, I've heard, and I'm sure you've heard, I think you wrote this book for me. And, you know, it just does express how universal needing to be seen for who you are is to all of us. And yeah, I think that's one of the great successes here. As I said in the beginning, I just, you know, I like most women, I always worried about the opposite thing, never that. And yet, you know, I related so much to your suffering over it and to sort of the identity issues you were struggling with. So next question is, you know, this is a deeply, deeply personal book. And it is so, I think, so difficult to take, you know, private matters, if you're not a person who regularly discusses your, you know, deepest, darkest secrets and make them public. I've done it, you've done it. But what was the process like for you? Because I'll just say for me, the other question people always ask was, you know, how cathartic was it to write and all this? And I actually found, you know, was it hard to write? People kept asking me, was it hard to write? And I found that I actually found the writing piece of it very satisfying. It was very satisfying to find the exact right word for all these feelings I'd been feeling and to tell my story. And I imagine you did the same. But I didn't think about the publication process when I was writing it. I didn't think about it at all. And so it was the weeks and months leading up to publication that I will say I was a white hot mess. It was like, oh, this train left the station. How do I pull this back? And just all that fear around exposing yourself.
Well, you know, I have kids, you have kids. That's a component here and I appreciate their patience with me as I've gone through this process very, very much, their tolerance. But I felt, coming back to the highly personal questions, what's the point of writing a book and if you leave that out? I mean, what have you told? You've told a sort of a semi-story, a fabrication, and you know, why spend 8 years on writing a fabrication? So it has to be, these things have to be said, or it's if not a sham, at least incomplete.
And did you worry about the reactions of some of the people in this book?
Of course.
Yeah.
Very, very much. And there are people alive who, you know, are from my parents' generation, and I'm hoping they don't read it.
No, I'm with you there. Well, I think, you did a very fair job. I think one of the things I forget, which, I mean, I feel like all memoirs say this, that you have to be as hard on yourself and you don't settle scores and so on. And I think you really sort of rode that wave very well. It felt like a very fair and balanced self-examination. So can I ask you what you're working on now?
Well, I finished a novel just before the pandemic, and it was supposed to be published next year. Whether it will be or not now is unclear. And it's the story of an entrepreneur who realizes that he lost his hearing to rock and roll. And because he's in the gadget business, he invents a hearing aid, which is to exaggerate his hearing loss as it becomes a sign of his love of music. And it's about the launch of the hearing aid and the family business that's involved in that. So it's part farce and part tragedy.
That sounds amazing, but I want to kind of say, as a writer, like, you just did this whole, it took me so long, and meanwhile you shoveled out another book in this whole time. I'm a little jealous.
Yeah, it actually, I mean, it probably will need to be rewritten, but it felt much easier to come by than the memoir, and I think that the memoir helped me. It enabled me to devise passages and situations and settings and conflict and so on, and imagine them, describe them, and paste them. So,
and it sounds like you're enjoying the long form after all, if you've already written another book.
I kept writing poems throughout, and I had my third collection published this year, but I didn't start writing until my late 40s, Adrienne. So, it's I can't sort of I can't say to myself, oh well, I'll get to that in 5 years or 10 years. I don't know, if my awareness will be there.
Right.
So I need to write the next thing or do the next thing and move on.
Yeah. Your awareness is going to be there. I'm not going to, I don't want to think about that, because then I'd have to start thinking about mine as well. Well, I see it's around 8:15. So I am going to ask everyone who's watching, if you have any questions, to put them in the Q&A. And I'm actually going to just look up at this now and see what we have. So from Alex, in connection with your comments about finding balance, your natural weight, could you elaborate on your inner experience with Beatrice? How did that become clear to you? How would you say that set you on a course very different from the unhealthy one you were on up until then?
Wow. I don't know if I can say a lot more than I said in the book. I think that when I met her, I felt that there was something right in me that allowed me, as opposed to previous experiences, that allowed me to appreciate someone else and be appreciated in return. And that's about the best I can say. It's hard for me to elaborate on that.
And it is actually an interesting point, though. So it is, of course, all about the self, not necessarily what the other person does to you. So in your own experience, like when do you feel like you got more distance and were able to see and understand? Did that mostly take place during the process of writing, or was it just the process of the years that went by that enabled you to sort of digest these experiences, if that makes sense?
Well, quoting Kierkegaard is probably a bad idea, but I just would say it's a shame. Excuse the paraphrase. Life has to be lived going forward, but it can be only understood by looking backwards. And so I think that as the more you look, the harder you look, the more you understand. It's the excavation of yourself and understanding what meaning is and what your meaning is. And with your particular set of details and coincidences is. So that's the best I can do there.
It's good. It's good. So we have another question. It says, John, this is Bruce Hager, Florence's friend. Memory is a tricky thing. We can remember moments, but not necessarily dialogue from so many years ago. We talked a little bit about that. Tell us how you recreated these moments and what devices you use to embellish them with what you know now.
Well, I tried really hard not to embellish them. I tried really hard to recreate them and sticking as closely as I could to the facts and dialogue. And of course, there's way too much dialogue for me to have remembered that exactly. So I had to hypothecate myself into those conversations. And that's, I guess, why they call it creative nonfiction, because you don't, you didn't tape your life. So you have to be able to recreate it as you can.
Yeah, yeah. Were there any parts of, oh, whoops, one other question just came in. Women are plagued by weight. How does the male experience different? How is the male experience different from the female one?
Well, I can only answer one part of that question, and that is that it's pretty clear that weight and stature are definitional for men, and the media sees it that way. Other people see it that way, and so there's the same comparison, but there's the same sense of comparison, of comparing yourself to what you're not or what you're told you should be. So that's what I'd say.
And a very astute question comes in from a Jane Wells. Adrienne and John, how has your experience of writing a memoir changed how you read memoir today?
That's a tough one. Go ahead first, Adrienne.
So you're going to have me do it first. No. I remember as I was getting ready to write my own memoir, I was in the middle of it, I should say. I read a memoir that I just loved. I thought it was really beautiful. And I read it as part of a book club. And I went to my book club, which was, just as you imagine, the cliche book club full of, smart, interesting, all women. And as soon as I got there, I remember one of them said of this book that I loved, well, I didn't believe her. And then they basically started to really not shred the author, but sort of second guess her. And I think that is the toughest thing about memoir is you're judged not only for your book, for your writing, and you write a novel, you're judged on the quality of the book. You write a memoir, you're judged on the quality of the book and your life. And that is I feel like Jane, I've totally skipped this, like I've veered off topic of the question, but I feel like I think about that more when I'm reading now, of not judging the life, but but admiring how someone understands their life, the thought process that goes into being conscious about their life. And also just generally people write memoirs because of some trauma, not always, but usually. And I think, I think it's really a powerful, it speaks to the spirit of healing, so you don't pass things along. I don't know that you feel this way in terms of how your relationship to your children, I wouldn't say has changed, but I feel like part of writing this memoir was making sure I didn't parent as I was parented. I didn't think I was going to, but it was wanting and craving a deep understanding of that. And having children is revelatory. It changes everything. And I remember that sort of ignited this desire to understand my past. I feel like I have gotten way off the question, but maybe you'll do a better answer.
Well, I don't know. I think that's a good answer. I think that I don't think it's changed how I judge a memoir. The memoirs I never liked, I don't think I'd like now, though, and the ones where the language is compelling and the scenes are compelling are the ones I'd like today. And I've never really liked memoirs which have specific pathologies. Those don't interest me, and that's what I was terrified of writing here. And thank God no one's asked me that question. But I don't like those books. Maybe it's easier to be precise about what their market is, but
Yeah. So we have got another question from Delilah. I wonder, in line with the previous question, how one decides to write something as a memoir in an era where the genre of autofiction seems to dominate books. I'm happy to do a little bit of answering for that from my perspective and then pass it on to you. But I feel like how I decided to write it as memoir is, frankly, I tried writing it every other way. And, as Jonathan and I were talking about in the beginning, trying to make it humorous, trying to do this, trying to do that, and then realizing, no, this story needs to be told straightforwardly in memoir, in as honest a voice as I can bring to the page, because it's my, it sounds hokey to say, but it's my truth, it's my story. And I think some things probably lend themselves well to autofiction. It wasn't going to be for me. What about you?
I had several readers say, hold it, is this fiction or is this real? And which I thought that felt complimentary to me. But I don't think it's autofiction in the sense of Ben Lerner. And I wouldn't want to, I don't think I'm capable of writing autofiction in that way. And certainly I wouldn't say that's what I've done here or what I wanted to do. But autofiction's a very, it's a very difficult term.
Yeah. Well, I do see that we are coming to the end of our time together. It's 8:25. If anyone else has a question, and if no one else does, I just want to say to this audience, if you haven't read this book yet, please go out and buy it from Greenlight Bookstore right this minute. You will thank me later. You'll thank Jonathan later. And also, even though you'll be buying it from an independent bookstore, it's really important to rate and review these things on these various social media platforms like Goodreads and Amazon. I know it's like blah, but it is how these algorithms work. So please, give Jonathan some stars and help his book get seen. It's wonderful. And Jonathan, it's been such a delight talking to you and seeing you. And I hope I get to see you in person again one of these days. And good luck with all of this.
Thank you. Thank you, Adrienne, for participating. And and sharing your own experience. I haven't spoken to that many other memoirs about how they did it or
how they survived.
how they survived, and so very, very interesting for me. So
Yeah.
thank you, and thanks to Greenlight for hosting us.
I want to thank you both for that fantastic reading and discussion, and thanks to everybody for joining us. Don't forget to buy your copy of The Skinny in-store or online at greenlightbookstore.com. The links are in the chat. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night. Bye.